The next presentation is framed as it speaks to issues of human rights and menstrual hygiene, and Hannah Neumeyer of WASH United will be live, I believe, presenting.
I believe so too. Hello everyone, and thank you for having me on this presentation on menstrual hygiene and human rights, Bloody Road to a More Equal World. Well, I'm presenting. First off, I want to say that I'm also speaking on behalf of colleagues. We prepared this together. Amanda Glassing from Human Rights Watch, Emily Wilson-Smith from iRights International, as well as Inga Winkler. And what we do at this conference and with this presentation is to kick off a discussion about menstrual hygiene and human rights, how these topics relate, and how we can use rights in all our work. So, placing menstrual hygiene in a human rights framework, what does that mean, and which questions do we need to ask ourselves then? Firstly, it's about states' human rights obligations. What are these? And especially, how far do these obligations extend? How do they relate to something as private as menstruation, and what does it mean in concrete terms? And finally, how can we overcome challenges in making menstrual hygiene rights-based, which I've heard a lot about already sort of throughout the day when I was listening in. So how does menstrual hygiene fit with then? The most important point about the human rights perspective is that it means that we define people or individuals as rights holders, and then the state and all of the state entities as duty bearers. So the state is the one that has to make sure that people can enjoy all of their human rights. And then there are different obligations under international human rights law. Typically, when people think about human rights, in my experience, they think about obligations of governments to not do something. So, for example, not to torture people, which is under human rights law, the obligation to respect human rights. But then human rights also create obligations to take action for states. So, for example, they create obligations to make sure that everybody will be able to enjoy their rights to water and sanitation. That's what lawyers call the obligation to realize or fulfill human rights. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly here, human rights reach into the private sphere. And are therefore relevant for menstrual hygiene, a very private practice, obviously. This is what's called the obligation to protect human rights. And just to give a very clear example, states have the duty to prevent and to punish violence against women, for instance, even if it happens at home. So if we look at menstrual hygiene and human rights together, then we're really considering what a state's human rights obligations are, how far they go, and what they mean then in concrete terms. So looking at those obligations, how can we best analyze those from a human rights perspective? The easiest way is to just look at the different human rights that are relevant when thinking about menstrual hygiene. And first off, maybe just for clarity, hygiene, and of course menstrual hygiene as well, is a practice that every one of us, every person, needs to fundamentally take care of her or himself. So there's no human right to hygiene as such. But if we think about situations where women and girls are not able to practice good menstrual hygiene, that's when human rights come into play, because it has impacts on human rights of women and girls. For example, on their human dignity, on their right to education, or their right to health. And on the other hand, certain human rights can also enable good menstrual hygiene management. So women and girls, when they have access to adequate water and sanitation, when they know how menstruation works and what happens, they will be much more likely to manage menstruation well. So rights to water, to sanitation, or to education are enabling rights for menstruation as well. And then with all human rights, regardless of which particular human rights we talk about, come important human rights principles, including, for example, and perhaps most importantly in the context of menstrual hygiene, equality and non-discrimination, but also participation. If you look at these, they really all demand that everybody's needs are included, and that then includes, obviously, the needs of women and girls, and in that, very obviously, the needs for menstrual hygiene management. So that's how human rights and these principles really speak to dignity and gender equality very much. And we try to map, if you like, a little bit what a human rights understanding of menstrual hygiene could look like. And what's at the core of this is that you look at the rights that are impacted by problems with menstrual hygiene together with the human rights that can enable good menstrual hygiene together with the principles, and then you get to a very broad and very deep understanding of menstrual hygiene in human rights terms or from a human rights perspective. Clearly, it's not just about materials or infrastructure, it's very much also about having the voice and space to articulate needs, about the ability to exercise choices. Because when women and girls can't practice good menstrual hygiene, we have that impact on dignity, on their ability to participate equally, which fundamentally are human rights concerns and go beyond just the question of inadequate materials or infrastructure. And since everybody in the room and online is very interested in working on washing schools, of course, we wanted to look at schools and human rights and menstrual hygiene a little bit more closely. So starting from the right to education, which every girl, of course, has, and which includes not just having a building that is called a school, but it includes that schools as institutions must be fit for the purpose of education, which includes for having wash infrastructure. It also looks, the right to education also looks at the curriculum. Having access to health-related education, for example, including on puberty, on menstruation, and on aspects that want to change stigma and taboos, that's all part of a human right of the human right to education. Because the purpose of that human right is to enable all children to reach their full potential. So it's very clearly an enabling right as well. And we all know the impacts that problems with MHM can have on girls' education, which interestingly, you can then even take it further to secondary impacts from a human rights perspective, because women or girls that don't enjoy a good education are much more likely. There's a clear link between that and preventable maternal deaths, for instance, and choices and many other issues, as you all know. So. Also from a human rights perspective, schools are a great entry point to begin discussions about menstrual hygiene and to do programming on menstrual hygiene and human rights. And on the matter of programming, this is just a chart that IRISE have put together in, and now my screen is giving up. No, it's not. That IRISE have working on MHM in schools. They were trying to look at all of the impacts and many different links that exist between MHM in their programming. So the impacts are clearly on health, education, employment, sanitation, and ultimately on gender equality and dignity. And you'll be or everybody at this conference will be very much aware of the consequences of that. So from a human rights perspective, I want to go back to the questions that we ask and how they may inform programming. So we've said human rights research is about looking at how a state is doing relative to its human rights obligations. It's also about the impacts and outcomes that any programming has on the enjoyment of human rights. And that makes it more qualitative than quantitative in terms of the questions that we're asking. Perhaps a clear example of that is if you think of women or girls having to use something like a dirty sock filled with sand to manage their menstruation. From a human rights perspective, I don't care whether this has quantifiable health impacts or not. Even if that was not the case, no health impacts, then I think everyone can agree that it's fundamentally a practice that undermines, and so from a human rights perspective is not okay. The quantitative data can very much help and is very important, but essentially human rights shift the focus from narrowing in on that quantitative data to really asking about if and how women and girls can achieve or enjoy their right to education and other human rights. And then there are, I think, very clear advocacy benefits of using the human rights framework and in menstrual hygiene as well. So, for instance, we could engage UN human rights mechanisms seeking recommendations on human rights and menstrual hygiene that can really help with advocacy at the national level then as well. International human rights law gives us a common frame of reference of dignity first and foremost, and then the many different rights that everybody has. At the national level, we can use human rights arguments to advocate for necessary changes in laws and policies and practice, and I'm not sure, but I believe that that has been one aspect in, for instance, Uganda and also in Kenya. And looking at education again and menstrual hygiene, if human rights law demands that students receive health-related education, including on menstrual hygiene, then it may be useful to use that argument to advocate for instance, school curricula that relate or speak of menstrual hygiene. So I hope with this, I hope it wasn't too abstract, and I hope I conveyed some sense of the many links that there are between human rights, menstrual hygiene, and also between many other sectors like WASH, like education, like health, like gender equality, and how maybe a human rights perspective can bridge those different sectors and can inform programming and research and advocacy on the topic. And just to reiterate the point that it's very important to broaden that evidence base away from the quantitative focus and to look at the qualitative issues related to menstrual hygiene management. And being aware sort of that this is a new topic that I hear about a lot, and all of my fellow presenters are asked quite a lot of questions about it. We just want to give you some references that are very clear on the topic of human rights and menstrual hygiene, and that we hope will be interesting for you. And finally, I'm waiting for the final slide, which is here. Yeah, as I said, we just hope that this can really start to begin a conversation about menstruation and human rights, and we very much look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. And not a huge amount of commentary on the chat box. The main commentary was in relation to the comment made at the last break about Procter & Gamble and pads. And just to clarify, There's lots of different products people can be using, I think, for every country, every culture, every girl, every school system, every family, to figure out what that product should be and what's most useful, affordable, and accessible. So just to say there's no one's saying reusable, disposable cloth cups, that there's one right or wrong solution. I think that's what different places need to figure out works best for the girls in their environments. Are there questions from those in the room? And I hope that the moderators will, take lunch as they need it. We haven't had a human rights presentation before, really specifically on that at, okay, Ellen, Walter for WASH Advocates. Can you take that?
Hi, thank you so much, Hannah. This is Ellen Walter from WASH Advocates. Can you tell me about any challenges you run into when talking to other sectors, specifically about the trying to push, for example, the human right to water? Do they feel that MHM is a key component and that should be included in that from a human rights perspective, or are they really focused on just the education of the challenges that we face in the advocacy world, for example? And so if you could just talk a little bit about that, whether it's gender rights or education rights. What has been your experience when talking with other sectors about that?
Hold on, we can't hear Hannah. Hannah, for some reason we're not hearing you. Just one minute. Oh, there you are. There you are. We have you.
I'm not sure you can hear me.
We can hear you.
I think you can hear me now. Okay. Interesting question. Thank you. And I think two answers. Internationally, this is probably something that not many people know, but there is a resolution from the Human Rights Council last year that actually explicitly mentions how menstrual hygiene management impacts on gender equality and also on education. And that was very well received at the Human Rights Council, which is the UN body where states discuss human rights obligations and further define them, find agreement on what they think human rights mean or don't. So far my experience has been that there it is quite well received. I think in terms of advocating on it at the national level or in whatever context you may be, it's about smart choices to me. What is most important is that everybody, or from my perspective, is that everybody working on MHM is aware how much it links to human rights and to how many human rights, to all of the many human rights that it links to. And then, very honestly, there may be countries where if you start a explicit human rights discussion, you may run into very deep trouble and doors might close. And there are other countries that are much more open to have that discussion. Similar in, like, gender equality discussions aren't the same in all countries. So I think it's very important for advocates at the national level to be very aware of the environment and to choose strategically which arguments they use, while being aware that they are also talking in a rights space and would like to achieve human rights, hopefully through their advocacy and their programming.
Great. Are there other questions for Hannah, because we have a little time?
Maybe I can just address, I wasn't able to read the chat box as I was speaking, but what you said earlier about the discussion on pads or different kinds of products and what's best, I think it's very important to know or to understand that human rights never demand one solution. They will always demand adequacy, and what that means can be defined in human rights terms, but again in broad terms. Many of you will know, for instance, that the human right to sanitation has to be accessible, affordable, available, and so forth. But what affordable means in any environment, for instance, needs to be defined there. And it's similar here. Menstrual hygiene management products are fundamentally a question of choice, and then there are questions of affordability and availability of such products as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, so thank you so much. Oh, you're not there anymore. I'm looking up at you and you're not.